This is chapter 8, and we're going to be learning about photosynthesis in this chapter. Let's start with a question to ponder for a moment related to this chapter. Why is grass green? So think about how you would explain that to a child, maybe like a fifth grader, in terms that they might understand. Do you know why grass is green? You might be thinking about things like chloroplasts or chlorophyll. And that's good because that is important. Those are photosynthetic pigments, but then I might ask another question. Why are chloroplasts or chlorophyll green? So to get an understanding of that, you have to know a little bit about how the visible light spectrum works and how photosynthetic pigment works. So to keep this at the most basic level without getting into super fine details, these photosynthetic pigments like chloroplasts and chlorophyll absorb certain wavelengths of light, and they utilize that to operate their photosynthetic capabilities, ultimately making food for the plant. So the particular wavelengths of visible light that are absorbed are not the ones that you'll see in the color of the plant. So for example, grass is green because it's absorbing all the other wavelengths besides green. And the green light of the visible spectrum is reflected. And so you see the colors of the visible light spectrum that are reflected and not directly utilized by the plant's photosystems for photosynthesis. We'll revisit this idea when we look at other examples of photosynthetic organisms, such as prokaryotes, that appear to be different colors besides green, because there are different types of photosynthetic pigments besides chlorophyll, which does give off, reflect that green color. So I know that was a long-winded response, and you would definitely simplify that for a fifth grader, but when you're learning about these difficult topics, really try to boil it down to what's, really important here, keywords, and have a basic understanding before we dig into some of the deeper concepts. Now, while we're still talking about grass, grass is a leaf, and it's on the leaves where the majority of a plant's photosynthesis takes place. Here's a more traditional leaf shown on the left. And if we could cut into that leaf and look at a cross section, you would see a different types of cells. Some of those cells are working together to perform a specific function, like in the mesophyll. These are cells that are undergoing photosynthesis. That's why they're green, because they have those chloroplasts inside. So the mesophyll is a tissue of the plant where photosynthesis takes place. There's also veins. This could be the xylem or phloem, or possibly both. These are specific tissues for conducting water and other substances through the plants, from, for example, the roots to the stems to the leaves. This is like the highway for those substances to be transported. Now, along with the mesophyll, where the chloroplasts are found and photosynthesis directly takes place, there, in order for those to operate properly, there needs to be gas exchange. So the stomata, which are typically on the underside of the leaf, are pores or openings in the leaf where gases can go in and out. Gases like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and although not shown here, also water vapor. We're going to zoom into a mesophyll cell, one cell, not so cartoony either. We're going to look at an actual image taken with a compound light microscope of a mesophyll cell. You can see many chloroplasts contained within that one cell. In fact, there could be up to 40 chloroplasts per cell. Each chloroplast is only a couple micrometers in size. On average, they are 2 to 4 micrometers by 4 to 7 micrometers, so a little bit more oblong or oval shaped although here they appear to be rounded. And to give you a comparison of size, each chloroplast is approximately the size of a prokaryotic cell, like bacteria. So this is why a prokaryote wouldn't contain chloroplasts, because they're basically the same size. Their whole body is, in a sense, a chloroplast if they have the photosynthetic pigments. And we'll come back to this idea later because although prokaryotes don't have membrane-bound organelles like chloroplasts, there are still some prokaryotes that can photosynthesize. They don't have the membrane-bound organelle, but they have membranes that photosynthesize. So hang on to that thought for later. Okay, now we're going to zoom in even further to the inside of a chloroplast, but for this, we're going to focus more on the cartoony image. However, this on the bottom is an image taken with a transmission electron microscope. And if you recall learning about the transmission electron microscope, or the TEM, you can look at the insides of organelles. So very, very tiny things, microscopically small, and also thin sections of those organelles. So this is like a slice through an actual chloroplast. And inside you can see these dark lines and these dark kind of rectangles. Those are the membranes that where the photosynthetic pigments are found, and the light is converted into chemical energy initially. So let's now focus more on the cartoony version of the chloroplast. Notice that, like the mitochondria, there's some similarities here. It has both an outer and an inner membrane, and in between those is the intermembrane space. Interior to the inner membrane is a fluid-filled region. That's the fluid itself is called the stroma. Think of that kind of like the matrix of the mitochondria. And then all this green stuff here is meant to represent the thylakoid membranes. Each little green kind of looks like a pancake. Got like stacks of green pancakes here. Each of those little pancakes is a thylakoid. Together, a whole stack is a granum, and inside of the thylakoids is a space called the thylakoid space. So definitely you want to review the anatomy of the chloroplast and know the parts, and then soon we'll talk about the functions of the parts and what steps of photosynthesis happen in each of these places. If I forgot to mention, here's a reminder, the chlorophyll is located in the thylakoids, and that's why they're depicted as green here, to show this is where those pigments are found. But remember, I mentioned that chlorophyll is not the only photosynthetic pigment, and you can see an example of that being true in the hot sulfur springs, such as the one shown on the left here. It's a beautiful, beautiful spectrum of colors, like a rainbow. And this is again filled with hot, very hot water, like scalding hot, would instantly hurt or kill somebody potentially if they happen to fall in there. Beautiful thing to see. I've never myself seen that. I hope that I do get to go one day. So the reason for the color is the prokaryotes that are living there. The photosynthetic prokaryotes appear to be the color of the light of the visible light spectrum that's reflected from their pigments. So some of them appear to be this coppery reddish orange color, and then it gets more of a yellowish orange to yellow to green. And then if you go deeper, you could look down into that spring. It might appear more like dark blues, purples. As you go deeper in depth, different wavelengths can't reach as far, different wavelengths of light. So that's why there is that effective color change as you go deeper into water. But it also has to do with the pigments of the prokaryotes. So another example on the right, something that we might have observed in lab, or you might have observed in a lab, Anabaena is a type of cyanobacteria, also a prokaryote, and it appears to have like a greenish, maybe even sometimes like a turquoise pigment color. So again, it's reflecting that wavelength that you see and absorbing all of the other wavelengths for its ability to harness the solar energy and convert it into chemical energy. So how is it that these prokaryotes can photosynthesize, yet they don't have membrane-bound organelles? Well, imagine that they're basically their own membrane-bound organelle. They, in effect, are a functioning chloroplast, if you will. So as shown on the right here, and we'll go back to the aerobic one on the left, this is a single-celled, sole surviving, independent prokaryote that has photosynthetic capabilities because inside of its cell, its body, are these thylakoid membranes. So it itself looks very similar to a chloroplast. It doesn't have a chloroplast because it is a chloroplast, and it has the membranes that serve the same function as a chloroplast. So this would be similar to the structure of each of these organisms. And again, they're not going to have a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles like chloroplasts or mitochondria. So that now let's take a look at the one on the left here. This is an aerobic prokaryote. So its structure is essentially like a mitochondria. It has respiratory membranes on the inside of its body where ATP synthesis takes place. So, and if you recall, all organisms need to be able to make ATP. So every prokaryote would have respiratory membranes on which it can make ATP, and they would not have mitochondria. Okay? So be sure that you understand that although we're modeling in the future lessons for photosynthesis in chapter 8, we're going to be modeling what would happen in a eukaryote inside of chloroplast, but I don't want you to forget the fact that there are prokaryotes that are able to still go through this process, however, without a chloroplast. So what is a chloroplast? How did this even come to be? Let's just take a moment to look at this endosymbiotic theory, the primary endosymbiosis theory, which was thought up by a scientist by name of Lynn Margulis, very famous in the field because of her being a woman and at a time when men were the predominant figures in science. She actually did the convocation speech at my brother's graduation from Syracuse University that I went to, and I thought that was so cool. I said, I know her. I learned about her and her theory. It's a really fascinating theory that how a eukaryotic cell came to have chloroplasts or mitochondria, because those in and of themselves could potentially live independently, as we see these prokaryotes that have the membranes on which they can make their own food or make their own ATP. So the theory is that a eukaryotic cell engulfed a free-living cyanobacterium, which would have been like the one shown on the right here, the photosynthetic prokaryote, or it could have been, you could substitute that for an aerobic prokaryote and model this for a mitochondria. Either one will work. So notice how now it has a two-layer membrane. It has the outer membrane, which is from the eukaryotic cell that engulfed it, and then its own membrane before it was engulfed. So this is how it's thought to have come to have two membranes, a double membrane for a chloroplast. And then again, likewise, you could substitute out that chloroplast for a mitochondria. So it's a very interesting theory that they live now in harmony and not that the eukaryote didn't actually, digest that free-living cyanobacterium for food purposes. It kept it around for benefit. I'm sure it's a win-win situation. They're both getting something positive out of that relationship. Otherwise, it would have just digested it for food. Okay, we'll end that for the first lesson of chapter 7, stay tuned for more in depth.